Welcome to ICOR's webinar on implementing ISO 22301. We welcome each of you here today. We're glad that you can join us. My name is Linda Nelson. I'm the president of ICOR, and I'm an expert member of the ISO committee. It's called Technical Committee 292. It is an international standards committee focused on continuity resilience. And I have helped to write the following standards, ISO 22301 and 22313, the requirements and the guidance document for ISO 22301 and 22313 on business continuity requirements. I also helped to write the standard just published in April on organizational resilience, 22316. As well as provided support for what's called a technical specification for the business impact analysis and the supply chain continuity, as well as the guidance document on exercising that came out a few years ago. This technical committee is also working on some other pieces of work, and I'll be talking about the revision of ISO 22301 and 22313 later in the presentation. The webinar objectives today are to learn about the requirements of the standard and to understand how to leverage your current BCM program capabilities to align to the requirements of 22301. The standard was published originally in 2012, and we know that many of you had business continuity programs that were built on, to DRI's 10 professional practices or to BCI's good practice guidelines or to other standards that you might have had within your organization. And so taking what you currently have in place as well as its capabilities and leveraging those to align to the requirements is really an important piece of this. For those of you that are building business continuity programs from scratch, you have a pretty nice opportunity to start with a clean slate and to build it the way the global community has encouraged you to do so. We're going to look at 8 primary competency areas of an effective business continuity management system and how they are best implemented. There is a questions button, so as you go through today, if you have a question, you can go ahead and submit the question, and at the end of the session I would be happy to take a look at those questions, and if I can't answer those during the webinar today, I will follow up with you individually as well. So the difference between ISO 22301 and 22313 is in its purpose. 22301 is a requirement standard. These are going to be the shall statements. These are the things that if you want to get certified or have your company certified to the standard, these are the things that you need to know. These are the things that your organization needs to demonstrate that it has in place. The guidance document really provides just what it says. It'll repeat some of the same requirements, statements that you'll see in 22301, but they'll have should statements. And it'll also give you information to help you understand how to implement those requirements. They are available for purchase from your national standards institutes. Standards are costed by the number of pages that they are. So it sounds weird, but the guidance document is actually more expensive than the requirements document just because it has more pages. I'd like to start off today with a poll, and for you to share what is your experience level or understanding currently of ISO standard 22301 and 22313. So give me a minute while I launch the poll, and you'll have about 30 seconds to answer. So it looks like about half of you have voted, so I'll give you a few more seconds. All right, I'm going to go ahead and close the poll. So it looks like with the audience today that about half of you have very little knowledge or experience with the standards, And then we have a few people that have used the standards to build the BCMS, and then about 23 to 28% of you have used them to align your current program and have used them to conduct a self-assessment. We only have 9% of the people today that have used them to do an audit. So we have mostly, I would say more than half of the people that are using this, that really are brand new to this today. So that's great. So let's take a look at what we would consider the 8 competency areas. And this is what we're going to be doing today is talking about the standard, and not necessarily in the order of the clauses, because it doesn't make a lot of sense to look at them in the order of the clauses in order to understand how they should work. So we're going to look at leadership and governance, planning and program management, the business impact analysis, the risk assessment, how to determine and document your strategy, how to implement your procedures, check your procedures, and do a performance evaluation. So the first competency area, leadership and governance. It's really important that your program has the support of top management, and this is really what it's about. When you look at a business continuity management system, the word management is a predominant word here, and in order for your system to work, it's going to need and it's going to require support from management. So right off the bat in the standard it says that management needs to demonstrate leadership for its business continuity management system. And it needs to demonstrate managed commitment. And it's going to give you a list of things that management should do, and that they have to do. One of those things would be to make sure that you have a policy in place. Another one is that you have identified the roles and responsibilities for the people that are going to actually manage the program. And one of the things that's new to the ISO standard that wasn't in the former British standard, and maybe you haven't heard before, is also identifying or defining the authority levels. One thing that you see often is that people are given responsibilities to do things, but not necessarily the authorities to make decisions. So what this standard does is to try to make sure that there's alignment between what you've been told you need to do and what you're actually able to do. And a lot of times you can see this as a spending commitment. So for example, you might be told that you are supposed to activate maybe an EOC, for example, but the cost of activating an EOC is actually more than you're authorized to spend. So making sure that there's alignment between what management has assigned you to do and what you're authorized to do. The other thing that top management is responsible for is determining the scope of your business continuity management system. And top management might be part of a steering committee. So whether you use a steering committee or a board or whatever you call that group of people, they should be representative of the entire organization, or at least the part of the organization that's part of your business continuity management system. So making sure that your steering committee helps you determine your scope, and they could make that determination based on the results of your business impact analysis, based on the results of your legal and regulatory requirements, or maybe there's a board policy, or maybe it has to do with supporting the strategy and objectives of the organization, your customer requirements, or maybe because you're in a high risk location or something like that. And oftentimes you're going to see the scope of a BCMS being aligned to particular products and services, especially if they produce an overwhelming proportion of the organization's income. Another new aspect of the standard that we haven't seen in previous standards is to understand the needs and expectations of interested parties. This is something that's new, and it's a really, really important aspect of the standard. So as top management and those accountable for the BCM policy and expectation, what sorts of needs and expectations do they have? What sorts of needs and expectations do those in middle management, those people that maintain the procedures, that own the procedures, and what sorts of needs and expectations do your incident response people have, and as well as the rest of your employees? These are people that are internal to your organization. But actually, I believe more importantly, those people external to your organization, understanding their needs and expectations. Number one, identifying who they are, who are your interested parties, And your top management is going to have one group of people that they would expect that they would include in their interested parties, and the rest of the organization are going to have different people. And it's really important to get the perspectives of each of these groups of people as far as identification of the interested parties. And secondly, who are those interested parties? What are those external interested parties? What are their needs and expectations? So what are the needs and expectations of your customers? And different customers are going to have different needs and expectations. What about your investors, your insurers, your regulators? If you impact your community, what about your neighbors and your different response agencies, your suppliers, maybe your family members and your shareholders? And we could go on and on with different external interested parties. So understanding their needs and expectations is going to help you to identify really how to communicate with those people, who should communicate with those people, how, meaning what method of communication should you use, and what sorts of messaging do they need to hear from you. This is something that you can include as part of your business impact analysis if you chose. It could also be something that you would include that you could just do as a separate activity. And I would bet that top management has some ideas of their needs and expectations of interested parties that other people in the organization wouldn't have, and vice versa. So it's not just one part of the organization that needs to go through this activity. It's really at all different levels. And then make sure that there's alignment between those needs and expectations between those different parties. So if you have an incident response personnel or somebody who's head of a division or a department or a business unit, that they have a perception of who the interested parties are and what their needs and expectations are, but also to then say, does that align with what top management says? To make sure that when there's an incident and you're having to make decisions, that those decisions are very complementary to each other and not at risk of being at odds. When you move to Competency 2, we're going to be talking about really project management, your planning side, as well as your program management. What sorts of things do you need to consider? So when we talk about meeting business continuity objectives, there's really two levels of business continuity objectives. At one level, you're talking about really the purpose of your business continuity program and what sorts of objectives should you have to meet the mission and objectives of the overall organization. And the second level objectives might be more like your annual objectives of what sorts of things you're trying to accomplish that year. What are the sorts of projects that you're trying to accomplish? So you need to be looking at both types of objectives. And your objectives that you write should be consistent with your policy. They should take into account the minimum level of products and services acceptable to meet those objectives. So if in your business continuity program you've decided that certain customers are going to be able to, if you can only produce 50% of your products and services, who gets those products? And you set your minimum level at that point with your planning. Your objectives need to be measurable no matter what level they are, and you need to take into account your requirements, your legal, your regulatory, your contractual requirements, as well as any requirements that you might have from top management. You should be monitoring your objectives, and they should be updated on a regular basis. The standard will never tell you that you have to do something annually, but they'll say as scheduled or at regular intervals or planned intervals and things like that, or as appropriate. It's always a safe bet that if you are going to do some updating and monitoring of things, that you do that at least on an annual basis. A lot of organizations do things like that on a quarterly basis. And then you are supposed to retain this as documented information. We're going to talk in a few minutes about what sorts of things that you need to document and what sorts of things you need to retain. Your business continuity objectives would be one of those things. So when we talk about planning to address risks to the BCMS, we're not talking about your traditional risk management. This is where some business continuity professionals get a little bit confused, because this is another new requirement that wasn't in previous standards before the ISO standard. And what we're talking about here is not risk to the organization, but risks to the actual business continuity management system, meaning that what are some things that could cause you not to be able to do the job that you are given to do. One of those might be the fact that you don't have enough top management support. So if you don't have the support to achieve your intended outcomes, you don't have the resources, you haven't been given the funding, or maybe there's people that you've been assigned to work with and have been assigned responsibilities, but they're not actually participating. You know, they're not doing what it is that they're supposed to be doing. So if you have that concern, that is going to impact your ability to achieve your objectives. And once you've identified what those risks are, you're supposed to work on preventing or reducing those risks. Because overall, what you're trying to do is achieve continual improvement. So if you've identified risks to your program itself, you need to put together some action plans to address that. And also, if you have some opportunities, like, you know, we all like to take advantage of when there's actually an incident, that's a good time to really work on improving that part of your program and to draw attention to the importance of planning for that. You also need to look at how to integrate and implement your actions into your processes. So when you're looking at the risk to your system as well, how are you going to integrate that into your regular planning? And then, of course, if you've created some actions and some plans, you're supposed to evaluate how effective those plans are. So really, Clause 6 is looking at project management, program management, and looking at risks to the overall program or the management system. They also want you to look at program maintenance and managing change, because you know and I know that as soon as you finish something, whatever you've written it based on has changed. So there should be somebody responsible for undertaking the planned maintenance, and that should be assigned. There should be roles and responsibilities assigned either to an individual or to a team of people. And when you're looking at program maintenance and managing change, you should be looking at what's changed since the last time we've done this, since our last update. What is the impact of those changes? So how are we going to need to modify our program based on the impact of these changes, and all the way down to what plans need to be updated. So perhaps your activities or the things that you're supposed to be doing in your plans no longer are relevant because of the changes that have happened. You've changed a provider, resource provider, or you've changed a recovery provider. Those things need to be drilled all the way back down to your plans. And then comes the fact of how are you going to distribute the new versions. We used to make jokes back in the day, you know, because everything was paper. And I really hope that while you should have paper versions available, that you're not only relying on paper versions, but how are you going to distribute the new versions? You know, maybe you have a 30-page document and you only need to change one paragraph. How do you make sure that the version control is correct and that people are using the right version? So that all needs to be part of your planning, and we'll talk more about that in a minute. When you're looking at your documented information, it's really easy just to say that all of your information needs to be documented and that all of your documents need to be controlled. When you're looking at controlling document controls, you're looking at things like version control, like we just mentioned. You're looking at who has access to those documentation and who doesn't have access, who has viewing access, who has the right to make changes to those documents. So while you don't have to, you know, keep track of every single document, I would say for sure they give you actually a list of documents that you need to make sure are part of your system. And I just say all documents need to be a part of your records management system, and as such they would be controlled. So whether you use SharePoint or a formal records management system, this would be something that would be very, very important for you to look at. You know, your BIA reports, your risk assessment reports, your plans, obviously, your exercise reports, and maybe even your, I wouldn't say maybe, for sure, even your documents like how you actually collected your BIA information. Did you use a survey? What kinds of questions did you ask? That sort of thing would be something for you to consider. When we look at Competency 3, it's very specific to the business impact analysis. But what's really interesting is that the The standard talks about the BIA and the risk assessment at the same time as at the start of the standard, and then it talks about them separately. So let's look at this. This piece of information comes from the guidance document, but it does summarize very nicely what comes from the requirements, and they talk about the requirements for the BIA and the risk assessment as one process or one activity. And before you can get started, it says you need to establish the context of your assessment. What they mean by context here is what is going to be the scope of your assessment. So whether you're doing a BIA, let's say you're doing a BIA, is it going to be on the entire organization? Is it going to be focused on one physical street address? Is it going to be focused on one business activity or a business division? You know, what is the scope of that assessment? What part of the organization are you going to look at? If you're looking at the context of the risk assessment, you might be talking about, are we only going to look at natural disasters? Are we only going to look at things that could impact our facilities or things that could impact our people? Are we going to be looking at all hazards type of planning? So here is where the context of the assessment has to happen first. Secondly, you're going to define your criteria. So for a business impact analysis, for example, your criteria might include your questions. It might include who's going to be part of completing your questionnaire or your survey or participating in your interview. For your risk assessment, it might be what sorts of criteria are we going to be looking at as far as a risk to our organization. Are we going to be looking at things that impact us severely only, or are we going to be looking at all sorts of things? And then you need to evaluate the potential impact of a disruptive incident, whether that's impacting you through your BIA or through your risk assessment. Your assessments need to account for legal and other requirements. Like we said, usually it's legal, regulatory, and contractual requirements. They might be also requirements per policy. And it needs to be systematic. So what the standard is requiring you to do is to make sure that you have a process for doing things, to make sure that you're not just doing it randomly. They want to see that you have a process in place. As a result of doing the BIA and the risk assessment, they expect you to prioritize your risk treatments and their costs. And here it also could include the strategies. So whatever you're recommending to implement to mitigate the risks and to ensure that you can operate continually, what are those sorts of things you're recommending and what are the costs for those so that top management can review those in a manner that works for them. What kind of output? Are you expecting to have a presentation? Are you expecting to have a report? Are you expecting to have both of those things? What is the required output? And there should be a commitment to making sure that your information is kept up to date as well as confidential, because anything that you're discovering in the BIA and risk assessment is going to be information that you probably don't want the general public to know. So how are you going to keep that information confidential, as well as how are you going to keep it up to date? Does this mean that you're going to be doing this on a regular basis, so at planned intervals? Is it going to be something annually, quarterly, as needed? What is your schedule for doing that? So we've talked about different data gathering methods. The simplest way to get started is a documentation review. What do we already have in place? Where are our strengths and weaknesses? Where are our gaps? Then you can design a survey or questionnaire that you can distribute to people. You can also use the interview method, and you can use a workshop or scenario-based exercise. I always recommend that, yes, you do all of these things, and you just might be using an interview for top management. You might be doing a survey for people that you just need some basic information from. But no matter what method that you use, you should have a question base that you create, and that question base should be used for your survey or questionnaire. It should be the basis for your interview questions, and it should be the basis for your exercise or workshop that you do. That way, no matter how you've gathered your information, you're getting consistent responses that you can compare between groups of people. And you need to make sure that your questions are consistent no matter what method that you use, because if you don't, you're not going to be able to analyze your results. So when you're doing your BIA analysis, you need to make sure that the data is correct, that it's accurate and reliable. And you do this by cross-mapping it with what other people have said. So if you're getting information that doesn't seem consistent from group to group, you're going to need to make sure that you are actually getting the correct information. It also needs to be credible. So making sure that the people that you're asking the questions are giving you credible information, that you're asking these questions from the right people. And again, tying on to being correct, it needs to be consistent. So if you've asked these questions 1 month and you're asking them the second month, that you're getting consistent data back. It also should be current. So what that means current for you, if your organization changes a lot and it changes quickly, the current's going to mean something different to an organization that really has very minimal change, and that therefore your data could be current for a year or two. And it also needs to be comprehensive. So make sure that you're asking the right questions of the right people and getting consistent and credible information back. So when you're doing the analysis, this is part of what you're going to have to do. If you're getting inconsistent data back, you're going to have to dig a little bit further to find out why that's the case. So looking at competency 4, with your risk assessment, don't forget that you also have to meet those requirements, about establishing your contacts, defining your criteria, and all the rest of those things. But in addition, what they recommend is that you use the ISO 31000 risk management process. You don't have to, but this is one of the things that they say that you could do. So again, you see establish the context is the very first part of that. And when you're looking at doing your risk assessment, there's really 3 elements: your risk identification, your risk analysis, and your risk evaluation, which then results in some sort of risk treatment that needs to be communicated and needs to be monitored and reviewed. So the risk identification is really what sorts of things might happen and what causes them to happen. In your risk analysis, you're looking at what are the impacts of this happening, what's the probability of it happening, and what's the likelihood of it happening. And then when you're evaluating it, you have to make some decisions. Are we okay with this, or do we need to do something to treat it? And when you go to treatment of it, there's ways that you can mitigate the impact or the likelihood of the risk occurring. It's not often that you can eliminate the risk, but you might be able to make sure it doesn't hurt you as much, or maybe doesn't hurt you as often. So when you're looking at risk identification, you generally look at internal factors. What are those internal things? What are the things that we can do to ourselves? Human error is a big deal. We do a lot of damage to ourselves. Just dealing with information security type issues, people not following the protocols that you have in place, that actually brings in risks and threats from the outside. So looking at internal factors, and it could even include things like people not being properly trained on what to do, as well as external factors. I think sometimes we focus a lot more on external factors than we do on the internal factors. And don't forget about those internal factors. They can have just as much or more of an impact, especially if you're in the technology space. They say that, that there's actually more risks in a data center, for example, of things breaking within the system than there are of people from the outside or organizations from the outside impacting them. When you're looking at risks of disruption, I wanted to clarify that under ISO 22301, you can set the context or set the scope of your risk assessment to be only looking at risks to the organization's prioritized activities. So there's a really big arguments between the philosophical way of doing this. Some people believe that you should do a risk assessment on the entire organization, on all of the activities of the organization, while other people say we only want to know about the risks to our prioritized activities. If you're going to only look at the risks to the organization's prioritized activities, you need to make sure that you've done your business impact analysis first, and that you have properly identified those prioritized activities so that you're not missing anything. And that's really the risk to your risk assessment, is that your scope or your context would be too narrow. But also we have challenges with trying to get funding for things. And so if you're trying to do a very large risk assessment on a regular basis, just keeping the financial commitment for that can be a challenge. So reducing the scope might enable you to do a risk assessment on a more regular basis. So we need to look at also the processes that those activities depend on, the systems they depend on, the information they depend on, the people that they depend on, as well as what assets are needed, what outsource partners are required, and what other resources that you need to support those. So when you're looking at risk of disruption, even if you narrow it to just those prioritized activities, you will also need to be looking at each of these categories as well. So once you've identified your risks, you usually would put them in some sort of an order or a listing based on the impact. So what is the impact of this thing happening to you? If it's a small impact, it's likely that you're not going to mitigate it as much as something that has a very large impact. So you're going to need to have some way of quantifying the impact that that risk would have on your organization. And it's not always possible to give a financial impact. So sometimes they'll say that it'll have a big impact versus a small impact, or you can use some other adjectives to put in there. But people at some point, whether you're using this based on historical data or whether you have some other way to analyze it, you're going to need to determine what sorts of impacts that you would have. And then, of course, the likelihood. And we always have, in the business continuity space, the question of, should we be planning for those things that happen often, that impact us often, and not really pay attention to those big things that can happen to us, but they don't happen very often? You know, that we always talk about the 100-year flood that seems to be happening every 5 years. So understanding the likelihood is also a challenge. So, and remember, this is the word estimate. We can't predict what's going to happen, so understanding that these are estimates and you're using the best data that you have to make these estimates is something that needs to be understood. As part of making decisions about how you're going to treat risks, what kinds of things you're going to accept, what kinds of things you're going to mitigate, you need to understand the organization's risk appetite. And this is something that needs to be clearly understood, and also understand that within the ISO standard it says you need to identify the risk appetite. Well, I can pretty much guarantee you that every single different department, business unit, division, or part of the organization has a different risk appetite based on what it is that they provide to the organization. So just like you've identified critical activities and that you're focusing on those activities that are critical versus less critical, you also have to look at what parts of the organization's risk appetites are smaller than others. So there's going to be some that are very risk averse. Any part of your organization that's tied to financial, that has regulatory and legal requirements, are going to be more risk averse than parts of the organization that are maybe in product development or in marketing or sales. You know, you're going to have very different risk appetites for different parts of the organization based on what it is that they do. And understanding that's going to be really important. Risk appetite was not part of any prior standards, and it's something that many people, many business continuity professionals don't have a really good understanding of. And so this is important for the organization and for the practitioner to understand, because it really gives you guidance on what to do for your organization. So when we're looking at risk treatment options, you know, if you can remove the risk to that activity, that's great. Don't do that. You know, let's put something in place that will protect us. You can transfer the risk to another part of the organization or to a third party, but I do want you to understand that you still own that. Transferring that risk doesn't mean that you don't have to deal with it anymore. You still own it, but maybe you've put it in a place that makes it less risky to your critical activities. I don't know if you can see this picture, but it's somebody surfing with the sharks. Maybe you should just stop doing that. If it's very risky, just don't do that anymore. And I don't know if you recognize Ralph. This is from the book The Mouse and the Motorcycle, and this mouse, it's a children's book, and this mouse always liked to ride his motorcycle, and his mother always said, fine, but make sure you have your helmet on. But, you know, sometimes we can do things to control or mitigate the risks so that they don't hurt us as much. You can, a lot of organizations finance their risk, or they use insurance. I would say that's probably the most common thing that organizations do, is have some sort of insurance, but that shouldn't be your only solution. And then there's some things that you just have to accept. We're just going to keep doing this. If it happens, it happens. We're going to have to accept this. And one of the things that you see when the standard continually says to you that you have to continually improve. So if you can show that the things that you were accepting 5 years ago that you're now mitigating in some manner, then that is a demonstration of continual improvement as well. So Competency 4 talks about your business continuity strategy, and you probably are going to have different strategies. Your overall strategy, which might be your corporate strategy, your operational strategy, your business unit strategy. So what you're supposed to do is take the results of your business impact analysis and your risk assessment and address those findings by developing a strategy for how to manage those and making sure that you meet your business continuity objectives. So the real challenge here becomes making sure that you can ensure that the continuing operations of your organization's critical activities at a cost that's reasonable, and there's your balance. I'm not going to really go through the argument between what's risk treatment and what's a strategy. To me, there's a very fine line between the two, and it doesn't really matter as long as you are helping your organization. So the standard says that as a result of completing the BIA and the risk assessment, the organization should identify measures that limit the impact of disruption on the organization's critical activities, shorten the period of disruption to those critical activities, and reduce the likelihood of disruption to those critical activities, and that you should choose and implement those appropriate treatments in accordance with this risk appetite. So if you're trying to align your organization to the standard, you can see that this risk appetite statement is part of all of the decision making that you do, really for all of your strategies and how you're going to deal with managing your risk. It's also going to help you that when you go to do your strategy determination and selection, that you're not going to be choosing things that top management isn't going to accept based on its risk appetite. So it gives you some parameters or some criteria for your selection. So you need to protect those prioritized activities. That's the number one thing you're supposed to be doing. And you're also supposed to be looking at strategies that will help you stabilize, continue, resume, recover those prioritized activities, as well as their dependencies and any supporting resources. This is a challenge in some of these clauses. The first statement, protect your prioritized activities, seems pretty clear. The next statement's got like 5 or 6 things you're supposed to be doing, and it's all in one statement. So when you're looking at trying to be compliant to a standard and getting ready to be audited, this is somewhat of the challenges when you have many requirements looped into one statement. And then you are supposed to mitigate, respond to, and manage your impacts. The standard is very much focused on impacts versus contingency planning. So best practice globally is that you look at your impacts and you try to manage your impacts. So impacts to your facility, impacts to your people, impacts to your supply chain, impacts to your financial standing, impacts to your reputation, and not focus on things like each individual threat, what it could, and doing contingency planning. We do know that you need some contingency planning for things that particularly are around life safety. So if you're in a hurricane zone, or you're in a flood area, or you have earthquakes, or if you have regular types of incidents that just happen because of your location, we understand that you're going to have plans for that. How to evacuate your building if you're in a building, or how to do your shelter in place. But understanding that for the rest of those things, you need to be looking at your impacts versus the causes. So when you're looking at different options for protecting your prioritized activities, you should be looking at the perceived vulnerability of the activity. So if you're really vulnerable, you're probably going to want to put something in place that's pretty rigorous versus something that, you're not really very vulnerable. You've got a lot of things in place already to protect yourself. You also need to look at the costs compared to the benefits. There's no sense in putting something in place that costs you more than if something happened to you, what the cost would be to the organization. And also the urgency of the activity. Well, some of your activities, you can't do everything at once. So at some point you're going to need to put things in some sort of an order. So when you look at the vulnerability of the activity, the cost of protecting it, and which ones do you need to focus on first rather than later, that's part of that process. And then, of course, your overall feasibility and suitability of the option. You know, does it work for us, or is trying to do this really going to be impossible? So these are some of the background considerations that you need to have. And some of this comes from the technical specification as well. I talked about the strategy document. One of the last things that you need to do when you're looking at the strategy is your resource requirements. So you need to be looking at what are the resource requirements of my people, of your information and data, what kinds of building requirements do we have, work environments, the utilities that support those buildings, what other facilities do we have, what equipment do we need, what are our consumables, and our information and communications technology systems, what sorts of resource requirements do they have, what are our transportation requirements, our financial requirements, and what are the requirements of our suppliers. So what sorts of resource requirements do we have from them as well? So you need to be looking at each one of these things as you look at your overall strategy selection. This is where the guidance document 22313 actually provides the most information. I would say about 50% of the content talks about your strategy piece. So this competency number 5 is a big part of the guidance document. So let's take a look at the different procedures that you should have in place. The standard says you need to establish and implement business continuity procedures, and then it talks about different types of procedures that all make up the business continuity program. So each one of these would be a component of the business continuity program. So you have to have an incident response structure. So when there's any kind of an incident, not just a life safety incident, but any sort of an incident, maybe it's an information security incident, maybe it's a data center incident, whatever it is, you need to have an incident response structure. You also need to have a way to communicate. So there's two aspects of the communication. One is warning people about something, and the other one is actually the communications before, during, and after an incident. They talk about business continuity procedures being documented in your business continuity plans, and that you also need recovery procedures. And then we're not talking about disaster recovery procedures in the words that we use to talk about ITDR. We're talking about more that returning to normal, your restoration type of aspects, procedures for that. And the standard gives us some general guidance for your procedures, that your procedures need to be specific. In other words, what are you supposed to be doing? Sometimes we use the word actionable. So when we're looking at procedures, can you actually do anything with those? Oftentimes they should be very step-by-step and very specific. What are the immediate things that you should be doing? But also understanding that they need to be flexible. So what you've planned for probably isn't going to be what's happened. So and changes exist. So what happened to start out might not be where you are now. So because you've had an incident that actually grew and it's gotten more complex, you need to be flexible. So having them be specific and flexible sounds like they're contradictory to each other, but they do need to be both. I mentioned earlier focusing on the impact versus focusing on the cause. And of course, they should be effective. You can measure the effectiveness of your procedures by running exercises and testing those to make sure that they work. One of the other things that's in the standard that I think is pretty helpful is it kind of gives you an outline of what should be in every plan. And I think if you look at different software tools and if you look at your own plans that you might already have in place, you should go and do a quick check. Do our plans include each one of these things? So every plan should have a purpose and scope. So you know when are you supposed to use it? What are the objectives of that plan? That really is tied very closely to your purpose and scope. What are our activation criteria and procedures? So what constitutes the need to activate this plan? What are our implementation procedures? What are we supposed to be doing? Goes back to having those procedures that are supposed to be specific, flexible, and focus on the impact. Your plans should identify the roles, responsibilities, and authority levels of the people that are supposed to be doing the work. They should include the communication requirements and procedures, so that if this is a public relations type incident, a reputational incident, your communication requirements are going to look very different than if it's a life safety incident, and it's going to look very different than if it's more of a business continuity or business interruption incident. And whether it impacts the community or whether it just impacts your organization, whether it impacts your legal and regulatory requirements or not. So those communication requirements are going to change, and this is where understanding the needs and expectations of your interested parties can really help you with your communication requirements. You need to define your internal and external interdependencies and interactions. So who do you depend on in order to do what you want, both internally and externally? What are your resource requirements? And we collected this information in the BIA, I would certainly hope. And what is your information flow and documentation process? Some people are confused by this requirement, and this really means, does your plan work? So is it effective? Do those procedures that you've included, do they work in a way that allows your plan to work as it's supposed to work? And that's the requirement that they're trying to get to there. And it really goes back to being effective with the first set of requirements. So the standard will give you more specifics on each type of procedure, but this is overall what each plan shall contain. It is part of the requirements. So this is something that I would consider really important to take a look at. So now you need to look at Competency 7, which looks at, do our procedures work? Do they work? So you're supposed to check those procedures. So making sure that people are aware. It is a requirement of the standard that everybody is aware of these three things, that you have a business continuity policy. Not everybody has to have access to the policy, but they're supposed to be aware that your organization has a business continuity program and that a policy exists. I don't really see why it couldn't be accessible to everybody in your organization, but that's again up to your organization to decide. You also everybody needs to be aware of improved performance, so that everybody has a role in the business continuity program, whether it is just the fact that they keep their contact information up to date so that they can be contacted when there is an incident. And they also need to understand the implications of not conforming. So if we're using a communications example, so you didn't update your cell phone number changed, or you no longer have a home phone number. So we can't communicate with you and we don't have a way of letting you know what's going on. That's going to be an implication. Or if you don't change your password for whatever reason, then the implications of that could be that you've put your organization at risk for somebody to hack in. The standard also says that you have to make sure that the people who are managing your program are competent. So first off, the standard does not tell you what those competencies are. They say that you need to identify what competencies you need in order to support your business continuity program. Then you need to make sure that everybody is competent, and if they're not, they need to acquire the competence and evaluate how well whatever activity you've put in for them, whether that works. You need to provide necessary education, training, and experience. So if you're hiring people, do they have the right education? Do they have the right training? Have they come with experience? Or is it something that you're going to need to do for them? And of course, this is something that you're going to need to retain as evidence of your action. So this would be a documentation. So whether these competencies are part of your HR program for hiring and part of how you evaluate people on their annual reviews, this documentation should be retained as part of your formal evaluations and in your records management system. You also need to have an exercise program, and these are just some names of exercises. You might call them completely different things, but what they're trying to do here is I show you that a plan review is pretty simple. A tabletop exercise, you're not actually doing anything, you're talking about what you're going to be doing. And that goes all the way through doing, sort of a games or simulations as well as drills, more of a functional exercise where you're at the EOC or whatever offsite location that you have, and all the way to a full-scale exercise where you're exercising multiple departments or perhaps the entire organization. So the key here is that if you have a business continuity program that's very mature, that's been around for a while, the expectation would be that you're no longer just doing tabletops. You might be doing tabletops, but not only doing tabletops, that you would have progressed to do more complex and be able to really push people a little bit more to make sure that they're competent to actually do those activities and implement those procedures when there's a lot more stress involved, and maybe over a longer time frame as well. Our last competency is about performance evaluation. So it is the responsibility of the organization to decide how they're going to monitor their performance, what kinds of measurements they're going to use, and how they're going to do that evaluation. So you have to set your own performance metrics. What are our performance metrics? How are we going to, if you can't measure whether you're attaining those if you haven't set them ahead of time. How well are we meeting our objectives and targets? So you go back to what we talked about at the very beginning, is what are the objectives of our business continuity program? What are the objectives that we're trying to meet this year? Or, the smaller objectives. How well are we meeting those? How are we doing on our performance of mitigation and strategies? Are those strategies that we chose and our risk mitigation things that we put in place, are they actually working? How compliant are we with the standard? So if you've decided that the standard is going to be one of the ways that you measure your performance, how are we doing? You can use historical evidence. So, this is an example of something that would be a life safety type thing. So how many accidents are you having on the job? Have those decreased over time? And making sure that you record your data and the results of that monitoring, because again, that should be part of your records management system. In addition, you need to evaluate your procedures. This is most often done with an internal or an external audit, or a combination of the two, as well as doing more informal self-assessments. So those should be in place. In addition, we talked about the word management being part of business continuity management systems. The expectation is that top management will review the organization's BCMS at planned intervals. Remember, I just throw out there annually, but at least planned intervals, to ensure its continued suitability, adequacy, and effectiveness. They use those phrases a lot in the standard. So is what we have in place still suitable? Is it adequate? And does it work? The management review should cover the whole scope of your BCMS, although it's not necessary to review all elements at once. And also remember that the review process can take place over a period of time. I actually believe that it's better to have management reviews quarterly, monthly, and where you can look at different parts of your program on a regular basis, and that you don't wait to just have something done annually. This is actually, you can catch things before they become a problem, and if your organization has a lot of changes, you're probably going to want to have shorter management review meetings with your executive sponsor or whoever owns it, or maybe with the entire steering committee, depending on how your organization is structured. But to have this on a regular basis, to me, makes a lot more sense to have it regularly scheduled than just to do it annually. But at a minimum, it says at planned intervals, but I would suggest that at a minimum you do it annually. And finally, your organization needs to demonstrate that it's continually improving. So you can do that in a lot of different ways, but you're going to need to demonstrate that what you had in place last year has been improved on this year. So this is a misnomer for some organizations that have sought certification, and maybe they come out and they don't have any nonconformities the first year, but then in the second year they get a nonconformity, and they're like, well, why do we have a nonconformity? We didn't have one last year. And it could be purely because they haven't made any efforts to show continual improvement from one year to the next. So you do need to show continual improvement if you're going to seek certification. And even if you're not seeking certification, who wants to be in a job where you're not getting better from year to year? I mean, I would expect people to want to do some continual improvement. This presentation didn't lend itself to having a lot of polls in the middle, so I have saved 2 polls for the end. So our next poll asks you to determine which competency area or areas you feel that you're most closely aligned with. So what we're going to do next, you can choose more than one, so this has more than one choice. So go ahead and make a decision as to where do you think you're in a good place. So I'll give you about 10 more seconds. All right, I'm going to close the poll and share your results. So it looks like most people feel pretty strong with their BIA and the risk assessment, and that would make sense because conducting a BIA and a risk assessment has been part of business continuity planning since the beginning. That's been the basis or the cornerstone of the program. Looks like the next strongest area is in the planning and the program management piece. And that would also make sense, and my assumption is that most of you are responsible for doing those sorts of things for your organization. The next piece is actually implementing your procedures, and it looks like the weakest area is kind of shared between your leadership and governance aspects as well as the checking and procedures. And I think these results are actually pretty much on target. Organizations only, those are the last two things. So if you were looking at more of a maturity model approach, the leadership and governance and the checking procedures and performance evaluation are the areas that tend to be the weakest overall for organizations. So these would be the places that you might want to focus your attention in the future. So let's go ahead and look at our next one, which is where do you really feel that you are the least aligned? So where do you feel the weakest? Where are your gaps? And hopefully we'll end up showing somewhat the opposite of what we just saw initially. And it really does look like that's the case. We're seeing the inversion of what we just saw with the previous question. So here's verification that the two polls actually got good results back because we did not have dissenting results. So I'm going to go ahead and close the poll so that you can see the results. And again, it looks like leadership and governance are the gaps, or where people feel the least prepared, and the most prepared is back to the BIA and the risk assessment. So that was interesting. I'm glad that you had the same sorts of results both times. So there's been a couple of questions that I want to answer. One is, will we get a copy of the slides? This is recorded, so while you won't get a copy of the slides on our webinar page, you can view the webinar again, and you can take a look at it anytime you would like. So that is available to you, and that probably will take 2 days. So today is Tuesday, probably either late Wednesday or Thursday. The webinar page will be updated, and you'll be able to take a look at that. The second question came from, does the standard work together with the good practice guidelines? And yes. So originally, the good practice guidelines were written, and the British standard 25999 used the good practice guidelines from BCI as the basis for writing the British standard 25999, and then 25999 was used as the cornerstone or the basis of ISO 22301. So now we're working backwards in that 22301 exists, and so BCI is in the process of updating the good practice guidelines, and those will be published in November at their annual conference in London. So you should be able to get access to the new good practice guidelines at the very end of the year. The last question talks about the ASIS standard, security and resilience in organizations and their supply chains. I'm not familiar with ORM.1. I do know that the security and resilience, and ASIS has published two standards. They publish a lot of standards, but two of those standards, one of them is called organizational resilience, and the other one is entitled business continuity. And I saw that those two standards are looking very, very similar. I do know the focus of the latest one that you're calling ORM.1 is about supply chain. And so that would probably be similar to what you're talking about with the ISO document on supply chain continuity 22318. That would be my best guess, but I haven't seen the ASIS newest document. The last question that we'll have time for today is, says we're working on the 22301 certification of our analysts. What roadmap would you say we should use to implement this standard? So my question would be, If you're certifying people, that's different from certifying your company. So certifying people would be to either get certified by ICOR, which I'll share in a second. Otherwise, the standard is about certifying the company and the requirements for the company. So give me a minute I have to just hide this screen so I can see. It kind of leads into my next question. If you're interested in learning more, ICOR has a course implementing 22301. It's offered as an instructor-led 3-day course. It's offered as an independent e-learning. It's also offered as blended learning. So if we have a small class size, we run it online and with an instructor. And we offer it as self-study, so if you just want to buy the course books. If you have a lot of experience in business continuity, you don't have to take any class. You can just challenge the exam. It is the ISO 22301 Lead Implementer exam, and that can be taken online as well. Our certification is recognized by BCI, so if you get certified as a lead implementer with ICOR, it is equivalent to their MBCI certification or membership. And I also we sent out an email last week that 22301 is up for revision. So do you want to share your ideas for improvement? If you have some good experience with the standard, please don't submit comments if you've never used the standard. But if you have used the standard in the past, if you could send an email to iso22301@theicor.org, we will send you the comment form and the directions on how to use it. The challenge is it's a very short deadline. As part of the U.S. delegation, we have to have all of our comments in by June 30th, even though ISO doesn't need them till the end of July, because everybody who's working on the U.S. delegation has to put their comments in to ANSI, and then they consolidate all of those comments and submit those under the U.S. banner to ISO. So there's a process for that, and so if you're interested in doing that, I will get that out to you today. So please send an email, and we'd be happy to do that. I do want to let you know we have an upcoming webinar series. The next one in July will be about communication strategies. In August, we'll be talking about risks to your critical environment, probably specifically the data center environment. In September, we're going to be talking about leadership. In October, we're going to be talking more about the IT side of things, preserving, protecting, recovering data. In November, we're going to be talking about information security, and in December about supply chain. So thank you very much for your time today. And again, if you'd like to share this with somebody else, the presentation and the webinar will be available. We also have it not only on our website, but it's on our YouTube station as well. So thank you, and have a good rest of today.